Death story.
Late-night horror stories. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Storytelling Channel. Tonight I have a scary story. Mysterious, creepy, strange, scary stories from cemeteries. I am also very happy to be the storyteller tonight. I hope to bring you an interesting story. Thank you. If you find this story interesting, please give me a like and share, so I have more motivation to make the latest videos. Now I will take you to this scary story, and don't forget to prepare yourself mentally when listening.
Story 1. The Shadow's Embrace. A sleep paralysis nightmare. The old house on Hemlock Lane had a way of seeping into your bones, not just with its damp chill but with a pervasive sense of dread. It wasn't overt. No creaking doors in the dead of night, no phantom whispers. It was subtle, a whisper on the edge of hearing, a shadow in the corner of your eye. For Elias Thorne, a pragmatist by nature and a man who scoffed at ghost stories, Hemlock Lane was just a cheap rental after his last apartment complex had been condemned. He'd signed the lease, tossed his worn boxes into the empty rooms, and tried to ignore the feeling that the house was watching him. The sleep problems started subtly. First, it was just the usual tossing and turning, the vague feeling of not being quite rested. Then came the vivid, disturbing dreams. Not nightmares, exactly, but hyper-realistic scenarios that blurred the lines between waking and sleeping. He'd dream he was awake, staring at his ceiling, only to jolt truly awake and find himself in the same position. It was unsettling, but he chalked it up to stress from the move and the new job. Then came the paralysis. The first time, it was like being caught in amber. Elias woke, or thought he did, to the familiar darkness of his bedroom. He tried to shift, to reach for his phone on the nightstand, but his limbs wouldn't obey. His chest felt heavy, as if an invisible weight pressed down on him. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at his skin. He tried to shout, to call out for help, but his vocal cords were frozen, only a strangled, desperate croak escaping his throat. His eyes darted around the room, wide with terror, straining to pierce the gloom. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed 3:07 a.m. A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty old house snaked down his spine. He wasn't just paralyzed. He felt watched, and then he saw it. At first, it was just a deeper shade of black against the already profound darkness of the room. A form, impossibly tall and gaunt, standing silently at the foot of his bed. It wasn't a person, not truly. There were no discernible features, no face, no eyes. It was pure shadow, an absence of light that seemed to absorb what little ambient glow filtered in from the streetlights outside. Its outline rippled faintly, like heat haze, as if its very presence distorted the air around it. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, but he remained utterly pinned, a helpless observer in his own nightmare. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, an oppressive, suffocating presence that filled the room with palpable dread. It felt ancient, malevolent, and utterly focused on him. He could feel its gaze, though it had no eyes. It was a pressure, a psychic weight that pressed against his mind, chilling him to the core. A cold, guttural whisper, not heard with his ears but felt directly in his skull, slithered into his thoughts. "You are mine." Just as the terror threatened to consume him, just as he felt sanity fraying at the edges, the paralysis lifted as abruptly as it had come. With a gasp that tore at his throat, Elias lurched upright, drenched in sweat, heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The room was empty. The shadow was gone. Only the digital clock still glowed, now reading 3:10 a.m. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his armchair, a blanket wrapped tightly around him, the overhead light blazing. He tried to rationalize it. Sleep paralysis, he told himself. A known phenomenon. Hallucinations are common. His mind, still reeling from the vividness of the experience, tried desperately to cling to scientific explanation. But the cold dread lingered, a residue of an encounter that felt too real, too personal, to simply be a trick of the mind. The incidents became more frequent, not every night, but enough to turn his bedroom into a place of dread. Every time he drifted off, a part of him tensed, anticipating the return of the shadow. And it always returned. Sometimes it stood by his bed. Sometimes it seemed to hover over him, its indistinct form leaning closer, the crushing weight on his chest intensifying. The whisper, always the same, chilling him to his core. "You are mine." He tried everything, sleeping with the lights on, leaving the TV on for background noise, even pulling an all-nighter, fueled by coffee, only to collapse from exhaustion and fall victim to the paralysis moments later. The shadow was persistent, a specter tethered to his moments of vulnerability. One morning, after a particularly harrowing episode where the shadow had seemed to lean into his face, its form distorting as if trying to merge with him, Elias stumbled out of bed feeling utterly broken. He needed answers. He typed, "sleep paralysis shadow figure," into his search engine, bracing himself for the usual scientific explanations. What he found, however, sent a fresh wave of dread through him. He discovered countless forums, blogs, and anecdotal accounts from people across the globe describing strikingly similar experiences. Waking up paralyzed, seeing a dark, oppressive figure, feeling a suffocating weight, hearing whispers. They called it the old hag, the night hag, or simply the shadow man. Some spoke of it feeding on fear, others of it being a malevolent entity that sought to drain life force. Elias, the pragmatist, found his carefully constructed worldview crumbling around him. He devoured every story, every theory. He learned about the scientific explanation, REM atonia overlapping with consciousness, causing a vivid dreamlike state. But how did that explain the consistency of the shadow figure? The identical sensations felt by thousands, even millions of people? The shared terror, the same whispered threat? It felt too specific, too purposeful to be merely a glitch in the brain. He found one particular forum post, buried deep in an obscure corner of the internet, that chilled him more than any other. It was from a user named Nightwatcher77, posted years ago. "It started for me after I moved into an old house. Just like many of you describe, the paralysis, the shadow, but it grew. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. Sometimes, I swear, I could see glimmers of eyes, red and burning, deep within its form. And the whispers, they started to change. From 'you are mine' to suggestions, dark, twisted ideas. It wants in. It wants to cross over. It's not just a dream, it's an invitation. Get out of that house." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Suggestions? He hadn't experienced that yet, but the mere thought sent a shiver through him. The user, Nightwatcher77, had never posted again after that. That night, Elias was determined to fight. He set up a makeshift barricade of furniture around his bed. He put on calming music, though his hands trembled as he did so. He even tried to meditate to clear his mind, to banish the fear. It was all useless. He woke, as always, to the suffocating embrace of paralysis. The weight on his chest was heavier than ever, pressing the air from his lungs. The room was darker, a preternatural gloom that seemed to emanate from the figure at the foot of his bed. But this time, the shadow was different. It wasn't just an indistinct mass. Its form seemed to ripple and condense, its outline sharpening, almost solidifying. And within its depths, 2 pinpricks of red light flickered, like embers in a charcoal abyss. Nightwatcher77 had been right. The whisper came, but it wasn't just a whisper. It was a guttural growl, a sound that resonated in his bones, vibrating through his very core. "You are mine." And then, new words slithered into his mind, cold and insidious. "Let me in. So cold out here. Just a little further. I promise I will make it stop." The malevolence was overwhelming, a tangible force pressing down on him, not just physically, but mentally. It wasn't just fear the shadow wanted to feed on. It wanted him, It wanted to possess, to inhabit. The truth of sleep paralysis, he realized with sickening clarity, was that for some, it was a doorway, a thin veil between worlds, and he was caught on the wrong side of it. He fought with every fiber of his being. He imagined himself screaming, though no sound escaped. He pictured himself lunging, though his muscles remained locked. He focused on a single point of light, a memory of a warm summer day, anything to push back against the crushing darkness. The shadow recoiled slightly, a faint hiss escaping its form, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It hadn't expected resistance. It had always found him an easy target, paralyzed by fear. But now, amidst the terror, a spark of defiance had ignited within Elias. The pressure lessened, ever so slightly. The red eyes flickered, their intensity wavering. The whispers became less coherent, a jumble of guttural sounds. He was pushing it back. He was fighting. And then, with a final, desperate surge of will, he focused all his energy on one single thought. Get out! The words exploded in his mind, echoing with a force that surprised even him. The shadow hissed again, a more pronounced, frustrated sound this time. Its form twisted, elongated, then seemed to unravel, dissipating like smoke into the deeper darkness of the room. The paralysis shattered. Elias gasped, a ragged, desperate sound, and sat bolt upright. He was shaking uncontrollably, drenched in a cold sweat. But the room was empty, truly empty. The oppressive weight was gone. The silence was just silence, not the absence of sound that had been the shadow's presence. He scrambled out of bed, grabbing his car keys. He didn't care that it was 3:30 a.m. He didn't care where he went. He just needed to be out of that house. He threw a few essentials into a bag, pulled on clothes, and stumbled out the door without a backward glance. He drove aimlessly for hours, until the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. He found himself parked overlooking a quiet lake, the rising sun reflecting off the still water. He felt exhausted, but strangely clear. The terror remained, a raw wound, but the sense of immediate threat was gone. Elias never went back to the house on Hemlock Lane. He broke the lease, forfeit his deposit, and found a tiny, modern apartment in a bustling part of town. He still had restless nights sometimes, but the paralysis never returned. The shadow never appeared again. He often wondered what would have happened if he hadn't fought back that last night. What if he had succumbed to its insidious whispers? The scientific explanation for sleep paralysis no longer satisfied him. He had experienced something far beyond a misfiring brain. He had encountered a truth that science couldn't explain, a chilling reality lurking just beyond the veil of consciousness. And sometimes, when he was alone in the quiet of his new apartment, he would feel a faint shiver, a phantom chill, and he would remember the red eyes in the dark and the low, guttural whisper that had claimed, "You are mine." He knew with a certainty that transcended logic, that he had narrowly escaped an embrace that would have consumed him whole. The horror wasn't just in the paralysis. It was in the profound, unsettling truth of what lay waiting in the shadows when you were most vulnerable. He was free, but the memory and the chilling possibility of what the shadow truly was would forever be etched into his soul. Story 2. The Whispering Collector. Clara lived for the quiet hum of her small, meticulously organized apartment in the heart of Boston. A librarian by profession, she found solace in the hushed reverence of old books and the predictable rhythm of her days. She was a creature of habit, and certainly not one to entertain notions of ghosts or phantoms. Logic and empirical evidence were her guiding stars. Yet the apartment, despite its modern comforts, had begun to feel different. A subtle shift in the air, a colder spot by the window that wasn't just a draft, a feeling of being observed even when she was alone. She dismissed it as fatigue, the usual stress of city life. The first incident was jarringly abrupt. Clara woke in the dead of night, her mind wide awake, but her body a leaden weight. She lay flat on her back, staring at the familiar stucco ceiling, utterly incapable of movement. Panic clawed at her throat, but no sound escaped. Her chest felt constricted, as if a great stone rested upon her. The bedside clock glowed 2:48 a.m., and then she saw it. Not a shadow, not exactly. It was more like a distortion in the air, a shimmering haze that slowly coalesced into a figure. It was humanoid, indistinct, but undeniably present, standing over her antique vanity table in the corner of her bedroom. Its form was tall and slender, almost frail, but with an unnerving stillness. It wasn't dark like a shadow. Rather, it seemed to absorb light, leaving a void where its features should be. What truly horrified Clara was not just its presence, but what it was doing. Its ethereal hands, impossibly long and spindly, hovered over her collection of small, cherished trinkets. An old porcelain doll, a polished stone, a miniature silver locket she'd inherited from her grandmother. It wasn't touching them, but rather examining them. A silent, meticulous appraisal. A whisper, cold as graveyard air, seeped into her mind. It wasn't words, not precisely. It was a string of thoughts, a low, buzzing hum of appraisal and curiosity. Interesting, intricate, a memory. Clara's terror amplified. This wasn't just a hallucination. It was an entity, and it was focused on her possessions. The thought was somehow more unsettling than if it had been focused on her. It felt like an invasion of her personal space, a violation of her very sense of privacy. Just as the pressure on her chest became unbearable, and the whispers intensified into a buzzing crescendo, she lurched awake, gasping for air. The room was empty. Her trinkets lay undisturbed on the vanity. The clock now read 2:51 a.m. She spent the rest of the night curled in a ball, shivering, the light on. The episodes began to recur with unsettling regularity. Always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Always the paralysis. Always the figure, now chillingly familiar, by her vanity. And always the silent, assessing whispers directed at her possessions. She tried moving the trinkets, placing them in drawers even in a different room. It made no difference. The figure would appear, its gaze drawn to wherever her most cherished items were. Sometimes, it would seem to float towards her, its form rippling, and the whispers would turn from appraisal to a low, hungry hum. Connection, emotion, mine. It was collecting, she realized with dawning horror, not objects, but the essence associated with them. Her memories, her feelings, her very attachments. Clara, the logical librarian, began to research, not sleep paralysis anymore, but the folklore, the legends. She found tales of entities that fed on sentimental energy, spirits tethered to objects, even ancient beings that collected human emotions like rare specimens. The scientific explanations felt hollow now, inadequate to describe the chilling specificity of her experiences. She started seeing faint imprints of the figure in her waking hours, a fleeting shimmer in her peripheral vision, a sensation of cold air in an otherwise warm room. Her concentration at work suffered. She became withdrawn, haunted by the anticipation of nightfall. One particularly terrifying night, the paralysis hit her faster and harder than ever before. The figure was already there, closer this time, hovering directly over her, its translucent form barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. The pressure on her chest was immense, stifling. She couldn't breathe, couldn't even whimper. The whispers were deafening in her mind, a cacophony of detached, analytical thoughts. Attachment strong, rich history, profound resonance. Its spindly arm, a hazy distortion of reality, began to descend towards her chest, not to touch, but to probe, to extract. As the arm neared, Clara felt a visceral tug, as if something intangible was being pulled from her very core. A memory flashed, vivid and sudden. Her grandmother, her hands gnarled with age, placing the silver locket around her neck on her 10th birthday. The warmth, the love, the sense of security. The figure was drawing it out, siphoning the emotion, the memory itself. Terror turned to a desperate, primal rage. This thing wasn't just observing. It was stealing what made her her. With a guttural, internal scream that ripped through her paralyzed mind, she fought. She pushed against the invisible arm, not physically, but with every ounce of her will. She pictured the locket, not as an object of sentimentality, but as a shield, a barrier forged of her love and memory. The figure recoiled sharply, a sound like glass fracturing echoing in her skull. Its form wavered violently, the light-absorbing void seeming to flicker. The whispers fragmented, becoming a chaotic, angry buzz. Resistance. Unacceptable. Mine. But Clara held on, focusing all her mental energy on pushing it back, on protecting the core of herself. The memory of her grandmother, of all the love and strength it represented, became a blazing light in the darkness of her mind, repelling the encroaching void. With a final, desperate surge, a wave of profound weariness washed over the figure. It seemed to shrivel, its tall form shrinking, the shimmering distortion fading rapidly. It vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the lingering chill and the phantom ache in Clara's chest. The paralysis released her. She gasped, sucking in air, tears streaming down her face. She sat up, clutching her chest, a profound sense of violation, yet also a strange, hard-won victory settling over her. Clara moved out of that apartment within a week. She didn't bother with a formal notice, just packed her most essential belongings and fled. She donated most of her sentimental items, breaking their tangible connections. The silver locket, however, she kept, wearing it constantly, a silent reminder of what she had faced. She still had moments of anxiety, especially when drifting off to sleep, but the distinct, predatory presence never returned. She knew, with the chilling certainty of experience, that it wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It was a collector of intangible things, a connoisseur of human emotion, waiting in the liminal space between waking and dreaming. And she had, by sheer force of will, denied it its prize. She had survived its embrace, but the knowledge that such an entity existed, and had once tried to claim her deepest attachments, remained a chilling truth forever etched into her soul. Story 3. The Flicker Man. Leo had always considered himself grounded. A graphic designer with an eye for precision, he found comfort in clean lines, logical processes, and the undeniable reality of pixels on a screen. He'd recently moved into a renovated loft apartment in a trendy, historic district, drawn by the exposed brick and the promise of ample natural light. The building had character, sure, but nothing that screamed haunted. Yet, within weeks, a peculiar disturbance began to fray the edges of his meticulously ordered life. It started with the lights, a subtle flicker in his living room lamp, a momentary dip in the kitchen overhead. He attributed it to old wiring, the charming quirks of an older building. Then, the moments of paralysis began. The first time, he woke feeling a profound sense of wrongness. His body was stiff, heavy, fused to the mattress. His eyes strained in the pre-dawn gloom, trying to make sense of the familiar contours of his bedroom. He tried to sit up, to move, to even twitch a finger, but nothing responded. His breath hitched in his throat, a silent scream building inside him. The digital alarm clock on his nightstand glowed 4:17 a.m., and then he saw it. It wasn't a solid shadow or a towering figure. It was an anomaly, a visual distortion. At the far corner of his bedroom, near the tall, arched window, the air itself seemed to shimmer, as if a heat haze had materialized indoors. Within this shimmering field, a form began to resolve itself. It was human-shaped, tall and thin, but composed entirely of fractured light and shadow. It flickered. One moment, it was a silhouette against the faint street lamp glow. The next, it was a burst of blinding white light, then a complete absence, only to reappear, vibrating violently. It was like a faulty projector struggling to display an image. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Leo. This wasn't just a physical paralysis. His mind felt ensnared, trapped in a horrifying loop. The Flicker Man, as he instantly named it, didn't move towards him. It simply stood there, pulsating, its presence making the very air around it crackle with an unholy energy. He couldn't discern features, but he felt an intense, focused awareness emanating from it. Then came the sound. Not a whisper in his ear, but a high-pitched, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated inside his skull. It was the sound of a dying fluorescent light, amplified, distorted, and resonating with a frequency that threatened to shatter his eardrums from the inside out. The hum intensified, mirroring the flicker man's erratic visual pulse. It felt like a probe, a drilling sensation into his very thoughts. Just as the oral assault became unbearable, just as he felt his sanity beginning to unravel, the paralysis snapped. Leo gasped, a ragged, desperate sound, and scrambled upright, scrambling backward until his head hit the headboard with a thud. The room was dark, silent, normal. The clock read 4:20 a.m. He spent the remainder of the night hunched on his sofa, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, every nerve screaming. The incidents recurred. Always the same time, always the same corner of the room. The flicker man, always flickering, always humming. Each encounter left Leo more exhausted, more unnerved. The hum began to echo in his waking hours, a phantom buzz in the back of his mind, especially when he was tired or stressed. His vision seemed to subtly warp, seeing momentary flickers in his peripheral vision, even in bright daylight. He tried everything. Setting up cameras, they showed nothing but an empty room. Sleeping with all the lights on, the flicker man seemed to absorb the light, appearing as a deeper void. Moving his bed, it just appeared in a different corner. He even consulted a doctor who, predictably, diagnosed severe anxiety and sleep disturbances, prescribing medication that did little to quell the underlying dread. He began researching sleep paralysis again, delving deeper than before. He stumbled upon niche forums, old folklore texts, and forgotten occult writings. He found mentions of energy eaters, frequency hunters, and entities that existed on the very edge of human perception, feeding on the electrical impulses of the brain, on the very act of consciousness. The flicker man, he realized, wasn't just a visual hallucination. It was a parasitic entity, trying to lock onto his unique mental frequency. One night, the terror escalated to a new, unbearable level. Leo woke, paralyzed, to find the flicker man not in the corner, but hovering directly over his bed, its chaotic light and shadow form filling his vision. The hum was deafening, a roaring gale inside his head, threatening to obliterate his thoughts. He felt as though his very consciousness was being stretched, thinned, absorbed. The flicker man began to project images directly into his mind. Not memories, but distorted, nightmarish fragments of other people's fears. A suffocating darkness, a boundless void, the echoing screams of unseen entities. It was trying to break him, to overwhelm his mental defenses, to fully synchronize with his mind and feed. But something within Leo snapped. This wasn't just scary, it was a violation. This wasn't just his fear it was feeding on. It was trying to become his fear, to replace his very identity with a cacophony of alien dread. A primal instinct deeper than logic surged through him. He wouldn't let it. He focused. He remembered his design work, the precision, the control. He imagined his mind as a firewall, a complex circuit board. He pictured the flicker man's chaotic hum as a corrupt signal, and he willed himself to disconnect. He focused on a single, clear thought. "No, you can't have me." He channeled all his mental energy, all his will into this single command. He visualized himself severing the connection, cutting the wires, shutting down the circuit. The roaring hum wavered. The nightmarish images flickered, stuttered. The flicker man's form seemed to destabilize, its flickering becoming even more violent, more desperate. It was being rejected. A final, ear-splitting shriek, like 1,000 television sets dying at once, exploded in his head. The flicker man spasmed, its light and shadow form compressing, shrinking, then exploding outwards in a silent, blinding flash. Then darkness, complete absolute silence. The paralysis vanished. Leo lay there, trembling, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. His head throbbed, and his ears rang, but the oppressive presence was gone. The room was still, silent, only the faint glow of the digital clock indicating the passage of time. It read 4:23 a.m. He didn't pack. He didn't even bother to shower. He grabbed his car keys and fled the apartment building, leaving everything behind. He drove for hours until the sun was high in the sky, finding himself on a remote stretch of highway, the city a distant memory. Leo never returned to that loft. He found a new place, a small, unassuming house in a quiet suburban town. The sleep paralysis never recurred. The phantom hum never returned. But he was changed. He still worked with logic and precision, but now he saw the world through a different lens. He understood that there were things beyond the visible, beyond the measurable, entities that existed on frequencies too subtle for most to perceive. Sometimes, when he was alone, he would glance at a flickering street lamp or a struggling fluorescent tube, and a shiver would run down his spine. He knew the truth now. The sleep paralysis wasn't just a medical condition. It was a vulnerability, a momentary window into another dimension, where things like the Flicker Man waited, eager to tap into the very essence of human consciousness. He had won the battle, but the war, he knew, was eternal, fought in the silent, terrifying depths of the mind. Story 4. The Architect of Whispers. Liam, a meticulous architect specializing in historical preservation, had always found beauty in the bones of old buildings. Their whispers, as he liked to call them, spoke of past lives, forgotten stories. He'd recently purchased a quaint, Victorian-era cottage on the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts. It wasn't grand, but its age and quiet dignity appealed to his sense of history. He spent his days sketching, restoring, and reveling in the solitude. He was a man of logic, of blueprints, and structural integrity. Ghosts were charming folklore, nothing more. The first hint of something amiss wasn't a sudden, terrifying event, but a creeping, insidious wrongness. His sleep, usually deep and restorative, became shallow, punctuated by vivid, disorienting dreams that felt too real, too close to his waking thoughts. He'd wake with a vague sense of unease, as if he'd just escaped a conversation he couldn't quite recall. Then came the paralysis. The initial episode was textbook. Liam awoke, but his body remained stubbornly inert. His eyes, wide with a burgeoning terror, scanned the familiar contours of his bedroom. The antique dresser, the stack of blueprints on his desk, the moonlight filtering through the lace curtains. All normal, except he couldn't move. Not a muscle. His throat was a constricted vice, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed 3:12 a.m., and then he saw it. It wasn't a distinct figure at first, but rather a shift in the air by the corner wardrobe, a distortion, a ripple in the fabric of reality, as if the very darkness had gathered itself into a denser, more profound void. It wasn't tall or imposing. Instead, it seemed to squat low and wide, clinging to the shadows. It made no sound, no movement, yet Liam felt an overwhelming presence emanating from it. A cold, suffocating weight that pressed down on his chest, stealing his breath. What truly unhinged him wasn't its appearance, but the immediate, invasive thought that pierced his mind. It wasn't a whisper in his ear, but a direct, intrusive thought, cold and calculating. There's a space, perfect space. You've almost built it for me. Liam's mind screamed. A space? What was it talking about? The terror of being helpless was compounded by the chilling implication that this entity wasn't just present. It had a purpose, and that purpose was somehow intertwined with him, with his very dwelling. Just as he felt the edges of his sanity fraying, a violent tremor shook his body, and he snapped free, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The room was empty, silent, save for the frantic pounding of his own heart. The clock read 3:15 a.m. He tried to rationalize. Sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations. his subconscious mind processing stress. But the thought, "You've almost built it for me," echoed in his skull, an insidious seed planted deep within his psyche. The incidents began to escalate, not just the frequency but the nature of the entity. It was always between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., always the paralysis, always the lingering presence. But the Flicker Man, as he eventually named it, began to manifest differently. Sometimes, he would wake paralyzed, and the entity would be closer, a low, squat mass by his bed. And as he lay helpless, he would notice subtle changes in his room that weren't there when he fell asleep. A book moved from his nightstand to the floor. A blueprint sheet, meticulously rolled, now crumpled slightly. A small, almost imperceptible scratch on his polished wooden floor, right where the entity had been. It wasn't destructive, but it was a quiet, intimate violation. It was touching his things, and the whispers in his mind intensified, growing more coherent, more unsettling. A perfect corner, the void fits, the emptiness welcomes. It seemed to be commenting on the very architecture of his home, assessing its angles, its spaces. It felt like it was studying his house, finding its weaknesses, its entry points. The line between waking and sleeping blurred further. Liam began to feel a constant, low-level hum in his head, particularly when he was alone in the house. He started seeing fleeting, almost translucent smudges in his peripheral vision, especially in the dark corners of his rooms. They weren't solid figures, just suggestions of something occupying empty space. He tried to ignore it, but the cottage, once a haven, now felt like a cage, its very walls closing in. He found himself sketching unconsciously, drawing diagrams that weren't architectural plans but strange, impossible geometric patterns that seemed to warp and shift, almost forming a labyrinth. He felt compelled to fill certain empty spaces in his home, as if directed by an unseen force. He bought an old, heavy armoire and placed it squarely in the corner where the entity first appeared, trying to block the space, to deny it. That night, the paralysis hit him with a force that felt physical. The weight on his chest was crushing, stealing all air. The room was plunged into an unnatural darkness, deeper than any night, as if all light was being consumed. The armoire in the corner seemed to vibrate, shimmering with a faint, unholy glow. And then he saw it. The Flicker Man wasn't just a distortion anymore. It was everywhere, seeping from the walls, coalescing from the very shadows of his room. It wasn't a single entity but a pervasive, oppressive presence that filled the entire space. And from this all-encompassing darkness, a voice, not a whisper, but a resonant, ancient hum, filled his mind, vibrating through every cell of his being. You try to seal what is already open. You try to build walls where there are none. This house, your mind, they are porous. I am the space between the bricks. I am the silence in the rafters. You thought you were building a home. You were building an entry point. The words were not just terrifying. They were true. Liam felt a sickening realization flood him. Every sketch, every renovation, every attempt to organize and define the spaces of his home had somehow, inadvertently, created a more welcoming environment for it. He hadn't been blocking it. He had been shaping the house for it. Then the true horror began. The entity didn't just speak. It began to change his perception. As he lay paralyzed, his eyes wide with unspeakable fear, the walls of his bedroom began to twist, the ceiling to recede into an infinite blackness. The familiar objects in his room elongated, distorted, becoming alien and grotesque. His own hands, visible in the faint gloom, seemed to stretch and thin, no longer his own. He felt himself becoming part of the house, part of the space it inhabited. His memories, his identity, felt like brittle fragments, being rearranged by an unseen hand. The entity wasn't just feeding on his fear. It was remodeling his reality, preparing him to be a permanent fixture in its own unholy architecture. He tried to scream, but the hum intensified, filling his head until he thought it would burst. He was being absorbed, assimilated. All his logic, his pragmatism shattered into a million pieces. There was no scientific explanation for this. This was a truth far older, far more terrifying than anything he could comprehend. Just as he felt his individuality dissolving, a faint, almost imperceptible crack echoed in the overwhelming hum. Perhaps it was the sound of his own will breaking, or perhaps the entity had pushed too far, too fast. The distortion in the room wavered. The stretching walls pulsed back to their original form. The crushing weight lessened infinitesimally. And then, with a jolt that tore through his entire being, the paralysis lifted. Liam scrambled out of bed, collapsing onto the floor, gasping, sobbing, trembling uncontrollably. The room was back to normal. The armoire stood silently in the corner. The scratches on the floor were still there, tiny, almost invisible, but undeniable. The clock glowed 4 a.m. He didn't pack. He didn't care about his possessions. He stumbled out of the house in his pajamas, leaving the door ajar, and ran until his lungs burned, not stopping until he reached the safety of the nearest town, the first light of dawn painting the sky. He never went back to the cottage in Salem. He forfeited everything. He moved far away, to a sterile, modern apartment building with no history, no character, no spaces for anything to inhabit. He tried to rebuild his life, his mind, but the fear never truly left him. Now, when he looked at any structure, any empty corner, he didn't see just walls and space. He saw the potential for the void, the possibility of an unseen architect working in the unseen dimensions. He felt a constant, low hum in the back of his mind, a phantom vibration that never fully faded. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when he lay in his bed, safe and sound in his modern, characterless apartment, he would feel a subtle chill, a flicker in his peripheral vision, and hear, not in his ears but directly in the deepest part of his mind, a cold, echoing whisper, the voice of the architect of whispers, forever reminding him of the truth. The space is ready. You helped me build it. And now, it is always with you. The horror wasn't just in the sleep paralysis. It was in the profound, irreversible understanding that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed, and that some entities don't just visit you in your nightmares, they become a permanent part of your world. Story 5: The Breathless Watcher. Arthur Hayes was a creature of habit and order. A retired archivist, his life had been a meticulous arrangement of facts, dates, and historical documents. He valued solitude, quiet, and the crisp predictability of his routine. His small, detached bungalow, nestled on a quiet street far from the city's hum, was his sanctuary. It was old, built in the 1940s with a sturdy, unassuming charm, and for years, it had offered him undisturbed peace. That peace, he would come to realize, was merely a fragile illusion. The first hint of the unraveling was so subtle, he almost missed it. Not a sound, not a visual anomaly, but a feeling, a pervasive, almost imperceptible chill that settled in his bedroom after midnight, regardless of the thermostat. A sense of being observed, even when he was demonstrably alone. He dismissed it as the creaks of an old house, the overactive imagination of a man too long in his own company. Then came the incidents. The first time, it began like a familiar, mundane awakening. He opened his eyes, vaguely aware of the pre-dawn gloom. He tried to shift, to stretch out a weary arm, but his body remained stubbornly, terrifyingly immobile. Panic, sharp and sudden, flared within him, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He tried to call out, to clear his throat, but only a dry, desperate rasp escaped. His chest felt heavy, as if an invisible, immense weight pressed down upon him, crushing the air from his lungs. The bedside clock glowed 3:03 a.m., and then he saw it. It wasn't a shadow, not a human form, not even a distortion. It was an absence, a deeper void in the already profound darkness of the room, clustered at the foot of his bed. It pulsed faintly, like a bruise on the night. It had no discernible features, no limbs, no head, yet its presence was overwhelming, singular, and undeniably malevolent. It didn't move, but Arthur felt an unseen, unblinking gaze fixated on him, a gaze that stripped him bare, penetrating his very core. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if his soul itself was being weighed, assessed, found wanting. A whisper, not heard by his ears but felt directly in the deepest recesses of his mind, slithered into his thoughts. It was thin, reedy, like dried leaves skittering across frozen ground. Still, so still, the terror was absolute. This wasn't a dream. This was real. This thing knew he was paralyzed. It was aware of his helplessness. Just as the suffocation became unbearable, as a cold, electric current seemed to course through his veins, the paralysis snapped. Arthur bolted upright, gasping, shaking, drenched in sweat. The room was empty, silent, save for the frantic pounding of his own heart. The clock now read 3:06 a.m. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his armchair, the overhead light blazing, a tattered copy of a historical text clutched in trembling hands. He tried to rationalize it. Sleep paralysis, a common phenomenon, hallucinations. His mind, trained in logic and evidence, clung desperately to these scientific anchors. But the chilling whisper, "Still so still," echoed in his skull, an insidious counterpoint to reason. The incidents began to recur, with increasing frequency and intensity. Every few nights, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, he would wake into that terrifying immobility. The absence at the foot of his bed became a chillingly familiar sight. Each time, its presence felt a little denser, a little closer, its scrutiny a little more invasive. And the whispers evolved. From the initial, unnerving observation, they morphed into a relentless commentary on his state. Struggling, so futile, or fear, a sweet offering. They were always delivered directly into his mind, cold, devoid of inflection, yet dripping with a subtle, predatory relish. He found himself dreading sleep, fighting against the natural pull of exhaustion, knowing that the moment he succumbed, he might wake to its suffocating embrace. He tried every trick he could think of, sleeping on his side, placing a crucifix on his nightstand, though he was not particularly religious, leaving a lamp on, playing calming music. Nothing worked. The creature, the breathless watcher as he had come to call it, was relentless. It seemed to thrive on his attempts to fight it, its presence feeling stronger, its whispers more profound after each failed defense. One morning, after a particularly harrowing episode where the watcher seemed to lean over him, its featureless void face inches from his own, the whispers became intensely personal. Your life, so many wasted moments, so much quiet despair. I see it all. It was sifting through his memories, probing his deepest regrets, his hidden sorrows. Arthur felt utterly exposed, violated in a way that transcended the physical. He wasn't just being watched, he was being read. He started losing weight. His meticulously kept bungalow became cluttered, unkempt. The archival precision that had defined his life began to crumble. He barely ate, barely slept, consumed by an escalating paranoia. He began to see subtle visual disturbances even in his waking hours. Fleeting, darker than dark smudges in the periphery of his vision. A sudden, inexplicable chill in a sunlit room. A momentary blurring of text when he tried to read. He was always on edge, always listening for the phantom whispers, always feeling that invisible, unblinking gaze. He searched the internet, desperately seeking answers beyond the realm of medical science. He found countless anecdotal accounts of sleep paralysis, many describing similar shadow figures or old hags. But none conveyed the profound, insidious, personalized horror he was experiencing. He stumbled upon ancient texts, obscure occult writings, references to entities that fed on despair, on untapped potential, on the very stillness of a life lived too quietly. Entities that became tethered to a soul, slowly consuming it from the inside out. The breathless watcher wasn't just a visitor. It was a parasitic presence, slowly integrating itself into his very being. He considered moving, but a chilling thought stopped him. What if it wasn't tied to the house? What if it was tied to him? The whispers had said, "I see it all." It had glimpsed his soul. Could he truly escape something that had rooted itself so deeply within his psyche? The very idea was a prison more terrifying than any physical structure. One night, the terror reached its crescendo. Arthur woke into the familiar, suffocating grip of paralysis. The air in his room was thick, heavy, almost viscous. The darkness was absolute, consuming even the faint glow of the digital clock. He couldn't see the Watcher, but he felt its presence everywhere, surrounding him, pressing in on all sides. It wasn't at the foot of his bed. It was the room, and the whispers. They were no longer whispers. They were a chorus, a multitude of thin, reedy voices echoing simultaneously inside his skull, overlapping, twisting into a cacophony of his own forgotten thoughts, his deepest fears, his unfulfilled desires, regrets, opportunities lost, unlived life, all mine. He felt a cold, alien presence not just on his chest, but within his chest, a creeping sensation as if invisible tendrils were unfurling inside him, tracing the pathways of his nerves, reaching for his heart, his very essence. He was being hollowed out, consumed. His memories flickered, not as his own, but as strange, detached observations. He was becoming an archive, a repository for the Watcher to peruse at its leisure. He tried to fight. He tried to scream, to lash out, to focus on a single defiant thought. But his mind was a battlefield, overrun by the invading chorus. He was losing. He was truly, irrevocably losing himself, just as he felt the last vestiges of his identity fraying. As the alien tendrils seemed to tighten around his very core, a new voice pierced the cacophony. It wasn't his own, but a faint, almost forgotten echo from deep within his memory. A voice from a long-lost dream, a distant hope. A voice that whispered, "Not yet, not all of it." It was a fragment of his old self, the rational, meticulous archivist, refusing to be fully cataloged by this monstrous entity. The chorus of whispers faltered. The pressure inside his chest eased, ever so slightly. The all-encompassing darkness seemed to recede, drawing back from the edges of his vision. The Watcher had not anticipated this flicker of defiance, this ghost of his true self. With a final, desperate surge of will, Arthur focused on that faint voice, that defiant spark. He latched onto it, clinging to it like a drowning man to a life raft. He visualized himself meticulously filing away the invading whispers, sealing them off, archiving them into a locked, inaccessible vault in his mind. He couldn't destroy them, but he could contain them. He was an archivist. It was what he did. The alien tendrils recoiled, a faint, hissing sound permeating the void. The darkness pulsed, consolidating back into the single, unblinking absence at the foot of his bed. Seemed displeased, frustrated, and then, with a sharp, violent shudder, the paralysis released him. Arthur lay there, gasping, shaking uncontrollably, his body an empty husk, his mind a ravaged landscape. The room was silent. The darkness was just darkness. The clock glowed 4:05 a.m. He was free, for now. But the freedom felt like a fragile, temporary reprieve. He didn't move. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the dawn. He knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it wasn't over. He hadn't defeated the Breathless Watcher. He had merely delayed it. He had sealed parts of his mind, but it knew its way in. It knew his weaknesses. It had glimpsed the blueprint of his soul. From that night forward, Arthur never truly slept soundly again. He moved out of the bungalow, sold it at a loss, and moved into a new, smaller apartment in a bustling city, desperate for the noise and activity to drown out the quiet. He tried to rebuild his life, but the meticulous order was gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing unease. He still felt the cold spots, even in crowded rooms. He still saw the fleeting, darker-than-dark smudges in his peripheral vision. And sometimes, when he was truly exhausted, when the city noise faded, he would hear it, a faint, reedy whisper at the very edge of his consciousness. A familiar, patient hum, always present, always waiting. Still, so still, he knew it was there, lurking in the deep quiet, in the spaces between his thoughts, perpetually watching, perpetually waiting for him to lower his guard, for the next moment of stillness, for the next opportunity to claim what it believed was rightfully its. The horror of sleep paralysis wasn't just the temporary terror. It was the chilling, irreversible truth that some visitors never truly leave. They become permanent guests, patiently waiting, watching, until the time is right to finally absorb you whole. And Arthur, the former archivist, lived every waking moment knowing he was merely a collection waiting to be fully catalogued by the Breathless Watcher.
Thank you everyone for listening until the end. If you find today's story interesting, don't forget to leave a like, a share, and follow me, so you don't miss the next scary stories. Wishing you all a peaceful night, and good night, if possible.